Hello and welcome to the Collecting Heroes podcast. My name is JD. I am the collector of collectors, and this is the podcast where I interview collectors from around the world, specifically pop culture collectors. And today's guest is Justin McNamara, who I actually met in person and astonishingly just happened to be talking about the podcast, and he told me very casually that he has 20,000 comics. So I thought he would be a really interesting guest to have on. Justin, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. This is awesome.
Yeah. So, as I just mentioned, 20,000 comics. How does this happen? The thing I always try and do with these podcasts when I start is I try and sort of get the story of how people come to love either the franchise that they collect within or a character that they collect. How did your love of comics or your collection begin?
Well, I mean, basically what it comes to, 20,000 sounds like an impressive number when you're perhaps 20. I'm 52. Mm-hmm. So I have been collecting since about 1973 or 74. So got my first comic when I was 4 or 5. I don't still have that one, unfortunately, because it was Iron Man number 63. Maybe even earlier than that. I'm not sure the exact number.
Okay.
But this has not been something that I've done over the past couple of years. This is a lifetime collection. This is 45 years of buying funny books and squirreling them away.
Nice. Funny books. Is that sort of how they were viewed when you started collecting them as a kid? Would you say that, as you got older, you came to a point where you're like, maybe I don't collect these anymore, or did that never happen? You're just like, you've just always loved them and you've collected them like ever since.
So it's an interesting thing as a kid. So in the 70s as a kid, it was something that was just always there. My parents found it a good way to get me as a child to read, because there's nothing easier than looking at a picture that's got words attached to it.
Yeah.
And in those days, I was reading, Archie and some Marvel and some Batman, stuff like that, other DC stuff. Also, believe it, once a month, my dad would buy me a copy of Famous Monsters of Filmland. So I always had sort of monster magazines around me as well, which sort of led to a love of monster comics too. In the 80s, as I got a little bit older, I realized that there was the more comics you had, the less girls were interested in you. So I didn't talk about my comic collection so I could get girls to be interested in me. So it was like a difficult balance. In the 90s, honestly, that was where my interest in comics waned a fair bit. I found that the comic industry in the early 90s collapsed under its own weight, and there was a period there that comics were just trash. And comics are generational. They're made for the people who are of a particular age, and I was sort of mid-20s to 30 in the 90s, so they weren't necessarily made for me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then the late 90s and the 2000s hit, and all of a sudden Marvel really got their mojo back somehow, after sort of doing just terrible copies of so either trying to be too manga-y or too much like Image Comics, which is another comic company outside of the Marvel and DC.
Yeah.
They finally sort of got their groove back and really started to do some quality stuff again. And then I incrementally got dragged back into it. And it's funny, I'm currently on the cusp of being a little bit out of it, because every time I pick up a comic, I'm like, I really want to like this, but I don't. So I've gone from collecting maybe $20 a month to 20 comics a month to I think I'm collecting 3 or 4 at the moment. And only one of them is a mainstream comic company comic.
Oh, okay. So you said that your first comic was Iron Man. Who would you say is the most prevalent character or franchise that you collect within?
It would either be, if we're talking a specific character, it would either be Captain America or the X-Men.
Okay.
I love Captain America, always have. And I was always sad because Stan Lee used to say that there's no way that there'd ever be a popular Captain America movie because throughout the world nobody wants to watch a movie about Captain America. They want to watch other superheroes, but to see something that's specifically American, they don't necessarily watch.
Yeah.
Interesting that he was proven wrong while he was still alive. The tragedy is that Jack Kirby, who created Captain America with Joe Simon, wasn't alive to see it, which is a bit of a bummer but the Kirby family.
Yeah.
So they know that their father and grandfather's creation has become sort of loved worldwide.
Did you like the
I
Chris
tend to follow.
Evans version in the movies as well?
I think Chris Evans is a great choice as Captain America. Like I'm a bit of a. I like my superheroes to be super and heroic.
Yeah.
I'm not a Punisher or a Venom sort of a guy. I want somebody who will stand up and like read the riot act against the bad guys for good reasons. So like the not necessarily the power set, but certainly Captain America and Superman are like right up there for me because they're there to stand up as a beacon of hope and all the rest of it.
I can do this all day.
I like heroes are supposed to be heroic. One of the things I know that you're a big Batman collector, and one of the things that I find disappointing more and more about Batman is they go down the path of him not being a hero. He's like they lean more and more into the vigilante side of it, and it's like I'm not quite sure if that's where Batman would go because of his reasons for being. But you know, the demographic of people wanting to see Batman beat the absolute crap out of people seems to be more than him actually being a detective and being a force of good.
That's probably one of the things I liked about the new movie, which I don't. Well, I think when we spoke last time, you hadn't had a chance to see it yet, and I think you're going to wait until it came out on streaming. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a because I work in retail and I work 5 days a week. I'm sort of a little bit in opposition of risking myself for the that awful C word that's hanging over our heads.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah. I completely get that. The detective part really comes out in this latest movie, which is great, and I agree with you. Like I think there's definitely while there was things I loved about the Ben Affleck version of Batman on the screen, like for anyone who loves the Arkham games, you got that kind of action in the Batman vs Superman when they got that warehouse scene where he goes in and just kicks the absolute crap out of the bad guys in there. That was a fantastic scene.
Yeah.
But then you have like the Justice League Batmobile with machine guns on it and things like that, and it's kind of like, yeah, that's not the classic version of Batman. Like he's all about, he watched his parents shot down. He's not going to use a gun and go shoot other people down. He's trying to avoid that, and he's trying to be a beacon of hope for certain people while also striking fear into other gangsters and whoever else throughout Gotham, so that they don't go out and murder people.
For sure. Like you couldn't find a character who's more anti-guns than what he is.
Yeah,
I can remember. I think in the mid '80s or maybe the late '80s, Alan Davis was drawing. I think it was Detective Comics, and I'm pretty sure it was Batman Year 2.
Mm-hmm.
And on the cover of one of those comics, it's got Batman with a shoulder holster and pointing a gun at you, the reader. And I can remember seeing that and going, Batman with a gun? What in the hell? This is the weirdest thing ever. And then 20 years later, it's like, oh yeah, I got 30 machine guns in my tank car. It's like, okay, we might have strayed away from the source material, but that's just it. The thing is with all of the movies is that they aren't necessarily things that are pure. They are based upon something.
Going back to that pure and going back to the comics, is that something that struck you as a kid reading them? Like, was there a purity to these characters, and like the fantasy aspect, obviously, where everyone as a kid wants to be a superhero or whatever when you're role playing as a child. Was there a purity in those stories that really brought you in and hooked you?
100%. For me, it was all about the heroicism of the character. They talk about comics being being like a male fantasy, but when they talk about that from a psychological point of view, they tend to be more sort of talking about it from, a sexual point of view, with the sexuality of the characters and all the rest of
Yeah.
it. But I find the male fantasy part of it being, for me, it was more, how good would it be to be able to go out there and do something good for people
And bring justice
and
to the world.
have people admire that good that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Again, Captain America and Superman come to my forefront because they're the front of my mind, because they're the people who stand up there and are like, I'm here to help, and I
Yeah.
think that's really cool.
And so it's funny that you talk about with Captain America, and then you mentioned earlier about the sort of the horror or the monster versions of characters as well, because a lot of those, there's a purity to them as well. I mean, if you think back to even like the earliest, it's not a comic, but Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I remember reading that when I was a young man. And that's like a classic story that about this monster who really just had this purity about him. Like he was an innocent person in the story. It's a tragedy, really. But is that another thing with those monsters characters, that there's a purity to them as well? Like, is that the element that drew you to those, or was it a different element with those?
So it's interesting with a lot of like, so if we look at the Marvel and DC monster comics, and we look at stuff like Adventure into Fear and Vault of Horror and stuff like that, in general, they were tales of revenge made to shock, like Twilight Zone. Like
Oh yeah,
the whole lead up is for that last page that shocks you. Like there's an artist and a writer, a mangaka at the moment named Junji Ito, and like he basically writes the same story, and the last panel is the panel where you go, "Oh my god, what?" And Marvel and DC comics that were horror comics were doing that exact same thing. Like it would work all the way up to like, the man murders his wife and then he's racking his brains as to how he's going to ever get away with it. And then she turns up as a zombie in the last panel.
okay.
And like you can basically take that template and just transpose every single story over the top of it. They were made to shock. Yeah, I agree. There is a purity to them because they were innocent horror, like it wasn't about a serial killer, and it wasn't sort of the stuff that we ended up seeing in movies a lot later. That was
Mm,
certainly, like the horrors of nuclear power, and here's this nuclear beast. The
yeah,
Hulk is a horror comic. Like
yeah.
the one thing that they keep doing wrong with the Hulk in solo Hulk movies, for example, is that they make him the hero. The
Ah,
Hulk's a force of nature that's there to destroy things.
see, I've never
And
read a
as
Hulk
a
comic,
movie,
so you're educating me here.
if you took a movie like Twister and took the tornadoes out of it and changed that to Hulk, that would be the perfect Hulk movie. The
Oh,
Hulk goes in and beats the crap out of things and then disappears. And I think that's a better. He's a monster hero. He's no better than the Toxic Avenger. Like
well, it's a whole thing. I mean, with the Hulk, it's the whole hulking out. If I got this right, my understanding of it through everything from a child watching Lou Ferrigno, through to now what we see in the movies. As I said, I've never actually read a Hulk comic. The more he gets attacked, the more powerful he becomes, almost,
the
right?
stronger he gets, yeah.
Stronger he gets. So I can only imagine that just leads to more and more and more rampage and destruction. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, that he even got bigger as he got angrier as well.
Ah,
Um,
wouldn't like me
so there
knowing
was
that.
and that was sort of an initial thing that they did. My fun fact about the Hulk is that in the original Hulk comics, he was actually grey,
Oh,
and yeah, the first couple of issues of the Hulk, he was actually grey, but the printing press couldn't do a consistent grey color, so he was changing from page to page. So when they
ah.
went to Stan Lee and said, "This is a problem, what will we do?" and Stan Lee was just like, "Just make him green. I don't care. No one's going to care about this character in 3 years' time. Just make him green." And they just changed him to green with no explanation.
Wow.
Yeah,
And
yeah, printing
now,
got better, so they went back and changed it. So he was grey in the '80s for a little while. He was a mobster hitman called Mister Fix It.
oh wow! I mean that actually makes me think of Solomon Grundy. Like when I think of a grey Hulk, like like that's what that makes me think of. But I mean now we've got him obviously in movie form. There's a TV show coming out, the She-Hulk TV show as well, which
Yeah,
has
can't wait for that.
I can't remember the name of the actress, but she's wonderful from Orphan Black.
Mm, yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to that as well. But there's so much we're kind of spoilt now with comic book movies and comic book TV shows and all of that. But going back to the actual comics themselves, there were so many comic characters that have come out. You talked about the 90s being a time for you that you didn't really identify with that. Or didn't identify with those characters and what they represented maybe at that time. Funnily enough, I was doing some research on comic books a bit, trying to find a bit more of the history, to maybe discuss with you here. And I noticed that 1991's X-Men #1 is apparently the highest selling comic of all time, with
Yep, they
8.2
printed a
million
million
copies.
copies of it. Yeah,
But apparently it passed 8 million as well.
yeah, yeah.
And
And
then,
it's, I mean, this was a problem that this was sort of the beginning of the image era, and this was sort of where I personally started to lose interest in comics. It was again, I love the X-Men, and
yeah,
Jim Lee's art, I thought back in those days, was amazing. I don't think that now anymore. I think that he covers up a lot of anatomy problems with a lot of little tiny lines.
so that's just
Like
one of the
he's very
clever artists too, though, right?
uh, yeah. I mean, John Byrne used to just not draw backgrounds so he could draw more comics. So, and Jack Kirby used to occasionally use photocopies of like he'd photocopy photographs of planets and put them in the background of Fantastic Four comics, and then just color them purple, just sort of that would be the background, because it was better than just like painting it all black and drawing all of these planets, like
Okay.
um, and it gave it like a kind of creepy, weird, and otherworldly look. So it was probably actually really smart. Yeah, the X-Men was sort of the beginning of turning, and it's a good thing. I shouldn't really say that it's a bad thing, but it went from, you know, Kirby and Steve Ditko and these guys, they never got credit for their work.
Mm.
That it took ages to get for these guys to get credit for their work. And you even go back and look at like 2000 AD. The first sort of 20 or 30 issues of 2000 AD, none of the artists or writers had their credits on the comics, because they were always afraid that these people would be stolen away by another comic company. So they stopped. They never credited them.
Mm.
Which is horrible. Like, not getting credit for an artistic endeavor is horrifying and unthinkable of in these days. You know,
Well,
like you
as
look
a
at the.
Batman fan, that
Let's go
makes
back
me
to.
sorry. As a Batman fan, that makes me think of Bill Finger, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. You know, and realistically, one of the things that always cuts me about the Marvel movies is like Stan Lee is like, most people think that Stan Lee created him by himself, even down to an action figure that came out of Stan Lee. He comes with Captain America's shield, and he had
uh,
nothing to do with the creation of Captain America. Jack Kirby used to tell this really funny story where uh, Stan Lee was, when he and Joe Simon had a comic studio and were creating Captain America. Stan was the nephew of the publisher, and Stan was forced into their, like, we need Stan to do something. So he was like the sandwich and coffee boy for Simon and Kirby.
oh,
And Stan always wanted to be a writer, so he was like, "Can I write something?" And the story that he wrote for Captain America was so bad that they didn't even want to draw it. So in the first issue of Captain America, there's a whole lot of comics, but one text story by a very young Stan Lee, because the guys didn't want to draw it because it was awful.
I think I may have heard that or something along those lines before. I think maybe watching a documentary about Stan Lee in the past. But I mean, a lot of
There's a really
what
good,
he did has really been, he became this figurehead for Marvel, obviously, and like he had charisma, right? So
yeah,
he was great in that regards, that he was able to get out there and sort of publicly put a face to comics. Kind of became, like, in a way, I felt like a little bit of the what's the Playboy creator, mental blanking.
Hefner,
Yeah,
Hugh Hefner,
he kind of felt like the Hefner of comics, right? Like,
totally.
yeah,
And you know what? Don't get me wrong. It makes it sound like I'm anti Stan Lee. I've got
no,
a
I don't think you
statue
are.
of Stan Lee like not a foot away from me.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that what he did was amazing. The best description that I ever heard of Lee and Kirby was Barry Windsor Smith in a documentary about Jack Kirby said that they were the Lennon and McCartney of comics. Um,
Ah,
one of them created brilliant things,
yeah.
and the other one made it smooth.
Ah,
And Kirby was the one that created amazing stuff, and Lee just was able to smooth it out and make it cool and make it work. And there's let's look in the history of music and the history of movies and all the rest of it. There's so often where there's two people that do stuff that's amazing. And none of the stuff that Kirby did solo was as big as any of the stuff he did with Stan Lee. Just the same as none of the stuff that Stan Lee did solo was as big as anything he did with Jack Kirby.
Well, that makes a lot of sense when you put it into those in describe it there with Lennon and McCartney. I mean, I just not only recently watched the Get Back documentary, and it's fantastic seeing the way they work together and just a complete different version of these people that you probably had in your mind, growing up and listening to their music, as these icons. And Kirby and Stan Lee are both definitely icons. And yeah, definitely there is this creative push and pull that happens a lot of time with people. I think I may have mentioned on a previous episode of the podcast that I played music for years, and I can completely identify with that from creating music and what it was like playing with other musicians. And there's a certain chemistry that you have with people, and I think it's the same for all art, right? Like there's a certain chemistry that you have if you're creating with people. Some people you get it and you lock in and you can do it, and other people there's a push and pull sometimes that you can get fantastic things out of because they push you to do things that you're outside of your comfort zone and really make something even better at the end, because you can get pigeonholed and think, oh, something should be one way, but
yeah,
you need someone sometimes to come and tell you, no, this is it. Let's try it this way or something.
I mean, Mike Patton, like using music again, Mike Patton from Faith No More.
Yeah.
He said that one of the reasons that the album The Real Thing was such an amazing album was because they all hated each other's guts and had different influences.
Well, their guitarist left after
together,
after Angel Dust, the album after that.
Yeah, to become a pumpkin farmer. But yeah, like they created this amazing thing, and it was because they all had that different skill set that when it all meshed together, it worked. And you're right, and like it's even when people have solo ventures, like I Twitch stream as a hobby, and my best nights are always when I have the best people chatting. So it's like, as far as I'm concerned, that's almost like a form of art, like I'm presenting almost like stand-up routines while I'm playing video games, and the reaction from the crowd like spurs me on to do more. So it's more of that sort of stuff, but yeah, certainly Kirby's stuff when he was solo. I mean, the Eternals is an amazing comic, and it's got some really high concept stuff. And when they decided to do an Eternals movie, they had to change it because it was so high concept that they didn't even think today that people would get it.
Doctor Strange probably had a similar thing going, I imagine, as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Doctor Strange is a lot more layered now. Like he said, this is just it with the movies, for example, is that there's, Doctor Strange has 50 years of history now, so he's got a lot more layers than when he was just like a magician.
Yeah.
Like the early Doctor Strange stuff, it was just like, yeah, he'd travel through time and he'd fight these alien beasties, but he really was just like, he was like those monster comics we talked about earlier, but we had a regular hero who would fight against the monsters that were trying to invade or take over, like Dormammu and all of these guys.
Okay. Look, the 20,000 comics, let's go back to that. How do you store these? Like, if you can give anyone tips like that are collecting comics, because obviously we could speak for hours and go on about Kirby and the art and the stories and everything as well. But from a collecting point, with all these, how do you store them? What sort of advice can you give to people when you're trying to collect that many?
The best advice I can give to anybody who's got 20,000 comics or who has a large comic collection is stop collecting soon.
Okay.
It becomes it is ungainly. Whenever we move house, it's like the first thing that I have to consider, and it's a pain in the butt. Don't get me wrong, I love my comics, but
obviously you still got them.
I'm sort of sitting in the office that I'm in right now. I have a bookcase to the left of me that has, I don't know, maybe 200 graphic novels in it. Behind me, I have a bookcase that has a whole pile of Marvel omnibuses and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But downstairs in, like, I've got a storage unit. I have, so you can buy. They're actually hanging file plastic boxes.
Okay. So not like a
you
long
would have
box,
your
or is it?
so it's a plastic box that I get mine from Howard Storage or something like that. Not to advertise Howard Storage, but yeah, if you are going to get a sponsorship from Howard Storage, I need more of those boxes, Howard Storage,
Fair enough.
because
Fair
I've
enough.
got more comics to go in
I'd
there.
probably try and get a sponsorship from IKEA if I did, because I think the things like the Billy bookcases and stuff are one of those things that I'll
Need
probably
more
need more of.
Calaxes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I get board games, so I need more Calaxes all day, every day. But yeah, so I use those plastic boxes because like I have my stuff stored in a place that's not necessarily good for things made of paper.
Okay. Okay.
So I've got these things in boxes that clip shut, and I've actually gotten little thin. You can buy from Bunnings like thin pieces of foam that have sticky backed, and they're made for like doors and stuff like that. So when the doors
Yep.
slam, they don't make a banging noise.
Yep.
And I actually have stuck those inside the lid, so when I clip it shut, it actually creates a seal as well.
Okay.
And then I've got about 30 closet camels down there to absorb any moisture.
Speaking of doors, I don't know if you can hear that background. I do apologize if there's any extra noise. But then my door's rattling. A storm seems to have just come over, and the wind and rain's just hit outside. So
Rain is what we do best in Sydney at the moment, right?
yeah, exactly. For the listeners, Justin and I, as I mentioned, we've met in person. We actually live not too far from each other. So this storm might be hitting you soon as well. So yeah, well, I mean that's a good tip. For people, obviously you've got to be careful. Like, I mean, if you're going to be storing these things, you've got to try and keep them dry and keep them safe. But you also mentioned, because the Kallax, we'll go to the other parts of your collection, because you're not just like, you are a multiple type of collector. You have records and
I'm a
also games, right? Like board games.
I'm a multi-collector, yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the my favorite things that I've ever heard is that collecting is hoarding with a purpose. And if we want to talk about people who hoard with a purpose, I will
Yeah.
put my hand up.
Okay.
Yeah. So in addition to my 20,000 comics, I have 510 board games. I have almost 1,500 vinyl records. I have about 4,000 horror movies on Blu-ray, 4K, and DVD. What other statues? So like I said, I've got a Stan Lee statue here close to me. I've got about 200 statues, and about 80 of those are just Harley Quinns.
Nice.
And those I've been collecting since the early 90s. So again, it's not something that...
Just got a new Harley Quinn statue myself, actually. I got one of the fashioned off the Paul Dini version, so the actual animated Harley. I'll just get it down so I can show you.
You mean proper Harley? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yes. Sorry. So people obviously can't see this when they're, but Justin can see this. So it's the classic. Yeah, it's the classic original Harley. This is an amazing statue that I got when they had a sale at Pop Culture. Obviously, not trying. All these companies, I might get like multiple sponsorships out of this.
Give us a deal. Give us a deal.
Give us a deal, please. Just give me some money or send me free stuff. Just send me free stuff.
That's cute. Because I get my very first statue I ever get was about 19. So when Image started in the early 90s, Dark Horse also tried to do something similar, and they did a thing called the Legend series, and they got people who were working for other comic companies to come up, not with a cohesive universe like Image did. They just sort of told them all to come up with their own ideas, and they did a little crossover here and there. And so Adam Hughes did something called Ghost. Mike Mignola created a thing that you might have heard of called Hellboy.
Yeah.
John Byrne did the Next Men. And a guy named Mike Allred, who is very much an artist influenced by sort of 50s comic art and a little bit of Archie as well, like Dan DeCarlo style Archie art. He created a thing called Madman, and the first statue that I've bought that I've still got is a cold cast porcelain statue of Madman. And I just went from there. So before Hot Toys became a thing, I've bought I've got various monsters from Sideshow Toys. I've got yes, so much crap. Even Funko Pops, like Funko Pops that I don't dislike, but I'm not a collector of them. I don't like go. I'm going to buy every single thing of this. Like
Well,
you
yeah,
buy every single thing that's Batman.
yeah,
I buy ones that I think, oh, that's cute. I'll buy that.
yeah. That's fair.
And I've ended up with 200 pops.
That's the thing.
Um,
I started with buying like I was like when I started buying pop vinyls, I was like, you know what? I could just get a few different pop vinyls and like my favorite versions of Batman. And then I was like, oh, well, I've got all these ones. Maybe I'll get that one. And then, oh, well, I'll get that one. Oh, actually, that one looks pretty cool as well. And then next thing you know, I got
Plastic
like,
crack. That's what
yes,
it is.
exactly.
It's
Plastic
heroin
crack.
in a box.
I think there's actually a documentary called Plastic Crack or something along those lines as well. Yeah. But it's, yeah, just amazing how many of them they bring out, and I can completely see that. I also have, you can see in the background from me, I've got Mandalorian, I've got Gizmo from Gremlins, so many different parts of pop culture that I'm like, if I collect
Like,
everyone in Star Wars, I'll be here forever. If I collect every Batman, I'm going to run out of space. Even though I've got a good chunk of the Batmans, I don't know if I'll ever be a completionist as far as that's
yeah.
concerned. And you
The
collected
only
so
two
many
sets
different
that
things.
I yeah the only two sets that I have all of is the Queen's Gambit, because I really like Anya Taylor-Joy, and I'm a huge fan of Walter Tevis, the author. And
Yeah,
so when that was supposed to be a movie, that's been like in like box office hell for like 7 years,
it's a
and
great
they
Netflix
finally
show.
decided, screw it, let's make a TV series out of it.
Yeah,
So when that came out, I was like, have a Walter Tevis character as a Funko Pop? Yes, thank you. And the other one that I've got the full set of is iZombie, and it's completely by accident.
oh,
Um,
wow.
I was given two. I bought one. I found out that there was only one left in the set, and came across it when I was like way out west at a Zing or an EB Games. I walked in and went, "That's the one I'm missing," and all of a sudden I've got all four of those. But
You got
everything else I've got is cherry picked. It's there's something will cross my path, and I'll go, "That's cute." Like at the moment, right now, I have a Fortnite action figure sitting on my desk
yeah.
for no reason other than that was a cool figure.
Now, iZombie was also a comic series, that or like a graphic novel,
A
right?
Mike Allred comic series, funnily
Yeah,
enough. Yeah, the guy who created Mad Men. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, okay, yeah. Because I knew that when I watched the TV show that it had come from that. I didn't know
The
who the
TV
author
show's
was.
a lot different. The comic was a lot more supernatural, whereas the TV series was like Veronica Mars, but Veronica was dead.
Okay,
Um, the 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 comic had things like there was mean girls at high school who they found out were vampires, and then there was like the cool kid at school was a werewolf, and there was a bunch of Frankenstein Goldem type boys who were after her and stuff like that.
that
So it was
sounds like
very
something
much a
that could have
different
been an
creature.
Archie crossover almost, like from some.
Totally, yeah, yeah.
Those
It's
older
almost like
ones.
what were they called, the Groovy Ghoulies? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I've never heard of the Groovy Ghoulies, but is that part of Archie's or
Part of Sabrina, yeah.
part of Sabrina? Okay, okay, okay. Yeah, look, there's so many comic series that are now being made into TV shows and movies. It's hard to keep up with all the authors and collect them all. And exactly like going back to your collection, there's so many things you can collect, and it's so easy to come up with 200 pop vinyls accidentally, essentially, because you're just like, oh, I love that, I'll get that. Oh, I love that, I'll get that. But I won't get the whole set, but I'll just get that.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, yeah, you've got 200 pop vinyls, but you're like, so you've got 20,000 comics, you've got 500 games, you've got how many 1,500 vinyls, like
Vinyl records,
vinyl
about
records,
4,000 horror movies.
4,000 horror
I
movies.
should point out that the most important part of
Is
my
there a,
collection is a patient wife.
yes, I was about to actually ask that. You got ahead of me. So your wife obviously, like, says, you've got your collection. Do you have a certain amount of space? She's like, that's your space, you keep your things in there, and this is my space, you keep your things out of here. How does that work?
So, in the office that I'm in right now, she's working from home now, and so she has her area. And this is the irony of it all: is that she's a minimalist. She would live in a white concrete box with just white furniture and nothing else if she could. Whereas I've got, like I said, There's comics here, there's comics there, there's board games here. I've got 2 screens here because I've got my Mac, and then I've got all my streaming gear here. I've got on the wall, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sets of headphones that hang on the wall here. I've got a skateboard on the wall. I've got an original Tron poster on the wall. Like my part of the office is chaos, and she's got this corner that's perfect. Essentially, the rule is it doesn't get to the bedroom.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, so the bedroom is or outside.
That's the sacred.
The interesting thing is what she doesn't know is my bedside table's full of horror movie magazines, and outside a very kind customer of mine who's a Star Wars collector and a fiberglasser. He made me for Christmas a couple of years ago a Yoda in carbonite. So he's only made like 3 of these things. He's got one himself, and he gave me one. And so I've got that outside, sort of in the outside area where nothing's supposed to go. There's just like this single Yoda, sort of frozen in carbonite. It's she seems to not mind that because it's grey and it sort of disappears into the.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. It's kind of like a visual white noise that she can sort of.
Yeah, exactly. Like, as you said, going back to the collection, like the funny thing is about all of the movies and all of the stuff that like we collectors are so lucky right now. Like. For a couple of different reasons. There's so many people who are into it. Like I can't tell you if I went back in time and told 16-year-old me that one day that the St. George Dragons would be wearing Iron Man jerseys on the field.
Yeah.
16-year-old me would probably hit me with something.
And for anyone listening outside of Australia, St. George Dragons are a rugby.
Yeah. It was a dirty secret. Like there was not much less that I could be than to be a comic collector as a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
I went out with a girl for 5 years in high school, and she didn't find out I collected comics for 2 years into that relationship.
Well, actually, that's funny. Like, we've kind of, that's that old saying, the meek shall inherit the earth. It's like the geeks have now inherited like the earth in terms of pop culture and everything that's coming out. And that even just that term itself, geek, if I'd have been called a geek or a nerd in school, which I'm sure I was at some point, with my love for Batman and other things, it was a derogatory term. Now it's like we've taken power in that. Like, it's like geek culture is something that's fun. Yeah. There's this massive, amazing community, and people feel empowered now to share their fandom and really, let their geek flag fly. Like,
I've always found it funny that that sports people would always, people who were fans of sports would always frown upon upon those who might get dressed up in a Batman costume and go to a comic convention, and then on a Saturday night you'd see them in their team jersey with face paint on, a bright green wig, and it's like, hang on, we dress up in our tribes. This is what this is all about. Like, geek culture is all about those of us who didn't have a tribe. Like, I had friends as a kid, but we were all the dweebs, and like we were all different types of dweebs. We weren't all comic collectors. We were like, one guy had the computer and one guy did this and one guy did that, but we got together because we were like the Revenge of the Nerds movie is so true. Like, it's the guy that plays violin, the guy that likes computers, and the guy that's good at maths. We were the same. We weren't sporty, we weren't smart, we weren't that. So we just sort of got clumped together. We were the Remains. And those Remains now have become a tribe, and that's like you said, it's really empowering that these people now, it's like, they have worked out that, hang on, we're not a part of everything else. We're a part of something that's potentially bigger than all of that.
I think we could probably thank the internet really for a lot of that. I think yeah, that's definitely. I think that's probably a good place to wrap this up. Really, like, on that note, fandom, and like, this is one of the reasons I created this podcast, is because as a collector myself and a lover of all these different parts of pop culture, I just wanted to be able to connect with other people within the community, with other pop culture collectors, share in that love. And that's why I think, it's amazing that I can have these conversations with people like yourself. So thank you very much for being on the podcast. Just before we go, where can people follow you if they want to, like you mentioned your Twitch streams and things like that? Where can people follow you if they want to come and find Justin? Let them know.
Yeah, cool. So I'm basically Germ69 everywhere. JURM69. 69 because it was the year I was born, you dirty people. It's for no other reason. So on Twitch I'm Germ69, on Twitter and Instagram Germ69. So yeah, please, if you want to see somebody old play video games badly, I'm the person that you need to be following on Twitch.
Well, I love your energy, and I think people should go and check it out, and should also follow you. You also had your own podcast as well.
Yeah, so COVID killed our podcast, unfortunately.
But if people want to listen,
Nerds of Oz.
Nerds of Oz, yep.
Nerds of Oz, yeah. So we did it for about 2 years. I think there's maybe 30 episodes or so. When it was like a combination of, we'd pick a movie and dissect it. We'd talk about toys that we'd bought. We did sort of Christmas guides as to cool stuff that you could buy your, I think we called it things to buy your nerd for Christmas. I even did one episode from PAX in 2019, and I had like a cosplayer, a guy who was almost professional Warhammer player.
Okay.
On the podcast, and that I had a guy who was number 61 on the planet for Pokemon playing. Who went to the Washington Nationals and all the rest of it. So internationals, I should say. So yeah, Nerds, they're still around there. You'll find it on your local podcasting. It's essentially 3 very drunk people talking loudly and swearing about comics and comic movies.
Listen, depending on who's listening, it may be exactly what they need to go listen to after this as well.
I think the biggest listener we've got is actually one of the guys who was on it, Shane. I think every time I see him, he'll tap his headphones and go, "I'm listening to us," and it's like, dude.
I'll make sure to link it in the description for people so that they can check it out as well if they want to go and have a listen to that. And also, I'll make sure to link your Twitch stream as well. So
cool, thank you.
Once again, thank you. I mean, we've spoken forever. It feels not like forever, but I know we've been speaking for a while, and we could speak forever in terms of comics and our love for them. But thank you very much for being on the show, and enjoy the rest of your night. To people listening, thank you very much for spending the time listening to us talk and geek out as well. Thank you very much, and have a great
pleasure.
night.
Thank you.
Cheers. If you liked the episode, please consider following or subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also join me on Instagram at Collecting Heroes, where you can see photos of the collections of the people that I'm talking to, as well as some of my own.